This is A New Angle, a show about cool people doing awesome things in and around Montana. I'm your host, Justin Angle. This show is supported by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. Hey folks, welcome back, and thanks for tuning in. Today is our December edition of Incentives and Instincts, a recurring series in which I speak with economist and friend Bryce Ward about some of the broader challenges facing our society. Bryce, happy holidays.
Happy holidays to you, Justin.
So today we're going to talk about trust in government, which appears to be at an all-time low or close to all-time lows. According to Pew Research, only about 20% of Americans say they trust the government to do what's right some or most of the time. And on the eve of a new presidential administration and a new Congress, it seems appropriate to contemplate why this is. Bryce, let's start with description of this landscape as you see it.
If you look at various surveys that have tracked this over time, if you go back 50 years, the majority of Americans used to trust the government.
Yeah, and at high levels, like in the 60s, during the 50s post-war period, it was sort of in the 60% range. So let's talk for a moment about why this might be.
The easiest way to think about this is the reason why people don't trust the government is because there is a constant deluge of information from interested parties in telling you that you shouldn't trust the government.
Right. Yeah. There's an industry in doing that.
There's a whole industry that is now 50 plus years old. And again, this is part of economic growth, right? The economy got bigger. The government is powerful. If I can steer it in even marginal ways, I can steer it to my benefit and collect very large returns from doing that. And so you have massive amounts of resources that are go into funding institutions that basically all they do is tell you why the government is bad. And there is no market that is telling you why the government is good. Whatever institution I don't control is bad. And every side has its own story.
Yes.
Right? So on the right, it's the incompetent, inefficient government bureaucrat who stands in the way of progress. And on the left, it's the incompetent, inefficient government bureaucrat who breaks the law.
Or is in the pocket
of the business, right? Is the revolving door. So everybody's targeting the institution that has power that they don't like. I think we need to break it down into what we don't do a very good job of is the 3 Ps discussion we had a few months ago.
Yes.
Right? Which is my problem with the vision of the government, or is my problem with the execution of the government, right? Because there are problems. There are always been problems on both sides, right? But what we have basically made it seem is that the government is incredibly bad at execution. And my view is that the government is normally bad at execution. The government has incompetent workers and, has people who mess things up and do things all sorts of bad ways. To the extent that government is somehow different than other large institutions. And again, that's the key, right? The key comparison is to a large institution.
Or a corporation.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is to what extent has Congress layered in extra hurdles for the government workers to have to deal with?
I mean, we've had a long cycle of competitive, close elections, right? So we're sort of a 50-50 environment for the last 20 years almost. That increases the vitriol, right? That increases the gridlock. Another piece is this media environment we're living in. On the left and on the right, we see completely different visions of reality. We're served completely different forms of media, information, etc. So social media and algorithmically driven information is a big part of this problem.
The market is way better at satisfying demand than it's ever been.
Yeah.
There's always been demand from a small group of people for stories about why the government isn't doing things the way that, whatever story you want. There is a bunch of buyers, not necessarily literal buyers, but people who consume that content.
Yes. Buyers being eyeballs.
Yeah.
Right.
And so now we have many more people who are engaged in the business of producing that content.
And there's a vast profit motive in producing that content and keeping people angry so that they stay on device.
That's right. And, and again, this isn't just about the actual media entrepreneur, right? There are tons of groups that want these messages out there as well because it fuels donations, right? It helps further their cause, whatever they think it to be, right? And so, we just have infrastructure essentially they're counter institutions, right? So what's changed is we have a bunch of counter institutions, right, that serve in opposition to the government.
So give us an example of a counter institution. I don't know if that's a term that a listener would be familiar with.
Well, it's just a competing institution, right? So, so think about it, out in the West where we live, right? The most prominent ones that you probably come across, right, are environmental groups that sue the Forest Service or the BLM.
Okay.
I'm very sensitive to this as a kid from Oregon, right? Like, my entire childhood was litigation over the Forest Service. There's groups on the right that do the exact same thing,
Sure.
right? There's groups in pretty much anywhere you look that are basically trying to, fight the government. And then we've kind of ceded a lot of these fights to the judicial branch. And so, you have this kind of war ongoing. This is not a war that ever stops.
Yes.
Right? It just shifts. There is a small army of people for whom their livelihood depends on this war.
It's a lucrative war.
Right?
So there's an incentive to keep it going, but there's a big cost of that war ongoing all the time. One, we don't make any progress in solving a problem. But two, like the public thinks we're just stuck.
And the public gets misperceived about the reality of whether government is effective or not.
Right.
And what the problems within government are, right? And so, again, and part of the challenge here is there really are bad actors. The question is at what point does the bad actor become such a problem that we have to deal with it? And what then is the solution that we create? And does that solution just empower different bad actors?
Yes.
Right? And this is the constant challenge of society. Murder and robbery are easy. The 10 Commandments stuff is easy.
Sure.
But once we get into, I don't like the bosses. The bosses are bad. So we need unions to counter the bosses. But then the union gets a bunch of power.
Yeah, the unions have bosses.
And then the union becomes powerful and it starts exerting its power in ways that we don't like.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, now what do we do? And it's just this constant trying to figure out, there should be groups that are holding government accountable, but what's the right balance for the groups? What's the right structure for that? And what percentage of the time do I need to catch the bad act? And then what's the right punishment to deter the bad act?
We've outlined a couple of reasons why this trust might be at all-time lows. The media landscape, the particular tightness of our elections for a long period of time. Are there other reasons that perception might not align with reality? Or in reality, should we trust our government less at this moment?
Government has problems.
Yes.
But Walmart has problems. I'm sure if you pulled in some employees of any large corporation, they would have a lovely venting session about all of the problems of the big corporation that they work for. I don't know the extent to which execution within the government is somehow worse than it was in the past.
Well, and I will say that government doesn't do a very good job of explaining how and why it's helping you.
Yes.
I mean, we sort of saw that play out in this election. We talked about it being the vibes election. I mean, there was not a substantive case for here's how we're going to solve problems with government.
Well, and honestly, we don't have an ongoing drumbeat of look at the success of the government agency.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. And it's funny, an example that comes to mind is Operation Warp Speed, right? There was an opportunity for the first Trump administration to kind of spike the football. We put in place a system to create a vaccine in rapid real time, and they did it.
Yeah.
And that's a huge accomplishment of government that was not celebrated. It was sort of warped into, because it was the Trump administration at the time, Democrats weren't trusting of the potential of the vaccine. Then you saw after Biden was elected, that instantly flipped. Vaccine vitriol just took a whole different political dimension than it ever had. So I think that feeds into this profit motive of this sort of generating anger, generating skepticism. And the parties sort of haven't figured out how to make the case, the proactive case for, hey, here's how we're making your life better.
I was in filing my taxes. It is exceptionally easy to download the entire budget. It's a spreadsheet. You can download it from the internet, right? So I downloaded the entire budget and I created myself a tax receipt. But, it's like, whatever, like N dollars for this entire agency. And so then I started asking myself, well, what does that agency do? And what I wanted was essentially a reasonably good explainer of every federal government agency. That really kind of gets into, okay, well, why does this thing exist? What is the problem that it's there to solve? A tax receipt is an idea that has existed for a while. When you get a tax receipt, what you really learn really quickly is that the federal government is an insurance company with an army.
Yeah.
Right? Almost all of your tax dollars, particularly if you include payroll taxes, is Social Security, healthcare, and Department of Defense. The IRS will file your taxes for you. It rolled out last year in a bunch of states. And if you have relatively simple taxes, there's always used to be this thing. Well, if the government already knows how much I should pay, why do I have, because if I file it wrong, they're going to tell me. You did it wrong. Like I did this when I was in graduate school. I got a letter. Here's a check because you paid too much. Right? You didn't fill this form out correctly. It's a majority of taxpayers. Their taxes are relatively simple. The government already has all the information. And there's no reason for you to spend any time and effort doing this.
Right.
And so, Janet Yellen, Treasury Department, said, hey, let's do this. Right? So it is now a thing. Now, immediately after the election, a bunch of Congress people have submitted a bill to ban this. So, government doesn't always
Based
work.
on contributions from the accountants lobby or something like that?
TurboTax into it. Government can do things and do things well. I hike on public trails all the time.
Yes.
Right? Those trails, they are Spartan, but I want them to be Spartan. They are reasonably well maintained. There's a parking lot. There's a road. They get improved every once in a while. Like, great. We don't register it because, again, as humans, we want to live in this agitated state of enragement. And there's always somebody out there who wants to sell me why the government is bad. And so should not be surprising that if you just, again, ask people a survey question where they probably aren't thinking too deeply, right? I guess you could change this percentage if I went through and said, let's talk about these various federal agencies and what they do and how they've impacted your life. Now, do you have trust in the government, right? Because you know what I have a lot of trust in? The National Weather Service, the Coast Guard. We could go on and on and on about very particular government entities that I'm like, yeah, they do an okay job.
There's something analogous in there to approval ratings for Congress. Congressional approval is somewhere in the teens, if not lower, but people tend to like their own member of Congress. And so there's something similar here. We say we like particular policies or particular agencies, or, I could rate the Forest Service highly or the National Guard or whatever that particular thing is. Yet when it rolls up into an aggregate, we can't stand it.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's an abstract, and again, this is where the larger environment, it thrives on keeping that abstract entity as the villain.
The boogeyman.
Right. Because there's lots of things that I can platform onto that vision in terms of how I can access you and your brain, right? And yeah, you're right. Though the more specific you get, the more people are going to be like, yeah, that's fine.
We'll be back to my conversation with Bryce Ward after this short break. A New Angle is proudly presented by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. This show does not happen without these pillars of our community, and I'm so grateful for their support and encouragement. And speaking of support, have you checked out our new website yet? anewanglepodcast.com. There you can support our show directly with a variety of subscription options. Subscribers get access to bonus episodes, additional segments, writings, and other benefits. So check it out at anewanglepodcast.com.
This is Anne Helen Peterson, and I am a senior culture writer at BuzzFeed News, and you're listening to A New Angle.
Welcome back to A New Angle. I'm here with Bryce Ward, discussing the bipartisan erosion of trust in government.
Most of what the federal government does, every administration is like, we're going to get rid of bad regulation. And there are, right? I just saw the governor of Colorado basically table sawed through like 400 pages of, ancient regulations in Colorado that they got rid of. Great. But for the most part, right, there's a reason why the regulation exists in the way it does. And yeah, like you may be on the bad side of that regulation and you want it changed, but there's somebody who's benefiting. and they will stand up. They're not just going to be like, oh, great, take it away.
Sure.
The reality is that there are almost no regulations that there isn't a constituency for.
Mm-hmm.
Again, a lot of this is just economic growth, right? The economy grows, we get more specialization, we get more people to tell you more things about different things. Like, if you went back to the 30s and 40s, people might trust the government a lot because they just didn't know very much, right? It's like, fine, whatever. Oh, they built a dam? Huh, how'd that happen? The government is doing so many different things that at any given point in time, I think it's 100% probability that it will be doing something that I don't like.
And I think, like you mentioned dams there, that high watermark for trust in government we talked about was in the post-war era. We're coming off of World War II. We're coming off of massive expansion of federal government, New Deal, all of that. A lot of building, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of social welfare programs that were very meaningful in people's lives. But over time, I think we realized that, like, wow, we've built a huge bureaucracy. There's a lot of inefficiencies. The direct connection to the Depression and World War II is a little less salient. And then we realized, well, with dams in particular, like, wow, there's a big environmental footprint here. And I think that arc explains the sort of diminishing trust, particularly on the left.
The dams on the Columbia River, Grand Coulee and Bonneville,
Yeah.
the first two. If you go back and read the politicians, the newspapers, these were the greatest things ever constructed.
Mm-hmm.
They were going to bring wealth and prosperity to the Northwest. And how are they going to do that? They're going to do it by providing electricity cheaply.
Yes.
Because at that time, electricity was incredibly scarce,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we live in such a world of energy abundance that it is hard for our brains to imagine what life would be with the level of energy scarcity that existed in 1933. In their incoming inaugural address, every single governor from the 30s to the 70s talked about the need for more dams on the Columbia. This was widely supported. This was, but yeah, there's a cost. And the set of people that didn't like those costs, because of the prosperity created by the electricity, not just created by the dams, but by other sources. Well, there was more resources to spill out and create movements that
Sure.
then opposed those dams.
Yeah. Okay.
And now we end up at a fight about dams, right? Like, should we take them out? Like, how many should we take out? Which ones should we take out? Nuclear power, right? Should we be building more, right? Like all of these things. And again, it's just pendulum swinging, right? Like it was probably too easy to build things in the 30s and the 40s, although certainly there were emergencies that probably made it so that was a good idea to make it easy.
We
to
got
build.
good at building stuff.
And now we are not.
We are not.
We have made it basically impossible to build anything because of distrust in federal government.
Which contributes to
the counter institutions, which is now why houses are expensive.
Exactly.
And why we don't have as abundant green energy as we could, right? Because while in the abstract, we all like, oh yeah, we should have wind farms and solar farms, but I don't want any transmission lines anywhere near me. And, organize these counter institutions, whichever ones might be on the right, I might align with on this particular thing of keeping the transmission line away from my house. Great. Go off and find some rule that they broke so that they can't build this, or
slow them down.
Make the cost so prohibitive that it never happens.
Let's talk about how we can break this, how we can improve public trust in government.
Government should always be striving to be good governance.
Mm-hmm.
And by good governance, this is where I want to separate vision from execution, right? Is we can always fight about whether or not you have the right vision, right? You've diagnosed the problem and have the good policy, all that kind of stuff. But that's ultimately the job of the elected politician typically. But once it comes to execution, right, we should have good people and good processes that allow the government to achieve the vision reasonably efficiently. And, to the extent that there are problems in government in terms of the execution, some of this is regulatory, right? The amount of things that you have to do as a government employee or to become a government employee. There's a whole HR process before the people that are hiring you ever even see you.
Sure.
Right? So to get to the person, and then there's a whole veterans preference. right? Again, regulatory environment. Maybe that's a good idea or
And
not.
yeah,
but, like,
exactly. There is virtue.
There's virtue in that
system.
But you basically, to the extent that the system is struggling to operate at the human level, there's the constraints that we impose on the humans, and then there's the humans themselves, right? And are we selecting the right humans? Government jobs are relatively low paying at the high end, but they're high paying at the low end. And I just saw this paper recently. If you make it past a year as a federal government employee, on average, you're going to be a federal government employee for the next 13 years.
There's some sort of selection mechanism where if this is a fit, it's a good fit.
Yeah, and ultimately, it's not even about making it the past year, because you're actually more likely to make it a year, even before any of the protections come in, right? And then, secondly, I also saw a paper recently that did a whole bunch of experiments with teachers, right, where they actually had, records on teacher effectiveness. And, they posed a whole bunch of different compensation type questions, right? And then they said, okay, well, given what we know about the teachers and their effectiveness, which compensation scheme maximizes for student performance, for teacher turnover, for, whatever. They had 3 different things. And, in every single scenario you consider, the workers want more performance pay and less retirement benefit. But, and then if we move this outside the system and said, well, who would even consider becoming teachers, right? Or government workers, right? Do we have the compensations, the compensation scheme that exists in government has enormous impacts on selection, right? Who's willing to take these jobs? And it is not at all clear to me that the things that we're selecting on in terms of who's willing to take these jobs are the things that make you most effective at that job. From a good governance perspective, right, there's always the job of making sure that we elect good people and that the elected politicians, to the extent that they select agency heads and, the political level of things, that they hire good people who have good vision and good management skills. But within the rest of the bureaucracy, we have challenges both with how many regulations we've layered on top of the bureaucracy, and how we're selecting people then to go into that bureaucracy and do their jobs. And again, most people working in the government, I think, probably do a pretty good job. Our society is enormously successful. This is the thing that you always have to keep reminding yourself.
Yeah, we do.
The United States is an enormously successful society. You could not have our level of success without reasonably competent governance. But to the extent that we want to improve and do better,
and more equally distribute that success.
That's right. And make sure that, every agency is Operation Warp Speed, right? Not to say that it's doing something in a rapid form or whatever it is, but it's achieving some degree of success that the public is like, yeah, great job, right? And to the extent that the public is like, oh, that's not a great job, it's because the public didn't like the vision. And so then we'll go vote on it.
Yeah, and ideally that's what elections should do.
Right? It's
right?
like
select people, the vision that represents the people.
That's right. I don't like that, this agency made this decision, but that's who we elected to make that decision. That's the direction that the election is the consequence of, right? No, then we just completely screwed that up. It was just, that's just boneheaded decisions by bad process or bad employees or whatever it might be.
Yeah, we should get to a point where we're selecting between good managers.
That's right.
Right? And the selection is based on vision.
That's right. And, the execution piece of it is, again, and it's a giant entity.
Right.
It's never going to be as nimble and as efficient as you might want to dream it to be.
But I think that goes back to our media environment too. There are those examples of incompetence or malfeasance or, all these bad stories, right? And those bad stories can carry such weight.
On Twitter, about maybe a month ago, was going around, oh my God, can you believe that the United States Defense Department paid $40 for this bolt?
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And then somebody from Precision Cast Parts, which is a company in Portland, right? Went on this long retainer. And it's one of the most beautifully written things I've ever seen on the internet, describing how, and I can't remember his name, in Gresham, Oregon, makes actually bolts that are $2,100, right? Because, and this was news to me, every commercial airliner made by Boeing or Airbus, there are exactly 2 bolts that connect the engine to the wing.
That seems important.
There are 2 bolts, and almost all of those bolts are made by Greg in Gresham.
Wow.
Right? And it takes Greg probably about $100 to make the bolt, right? But there's $2,100 in paperwork documenting that every single micron of that bolt is as specified in the engineering. And so it's really easy to kind of, and this was the original one that we all learned in the 80s, was the $400 hammers in the Defense Department.
Yeah, the toilet seats and all that stuff.
The toilet seats. And, easy, real easy media sell. Lots of clicks and engagement, right?
Yeah.
But not enough people are the guy from Precision Cast Parts basically saying, hey, there's a reason why we spend that much money for those things. Every once in a while, it's corruption and malfeasance. And we want to eliminate that when we find it. But the problem becomes there's a tension between how much bad act we want to allow in the system and how much we want to then burden the system to try and weed it out. And that struggle is something we are incredibly bad at.
Right.
Right? And that's fundamentally what this is, right? Is to understand trust is to also then trust that, you found me an example of something that sounds bad. Or the other one, like, the thing that people love to talk about are, the crazy science findings.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Right? Well, guess...
Or what got funded.
Yeah. Well, guess what also sounded insane? We should study Gila monster saliva. And it turns out that Gila monster saliva is what gave us Ozempic. Lots of crazy sounding scientific research is not at all crazy once you get into, well, what are we doing with this? Right? And where do we think this might have applications? We can't see it when you're sitting there in the public, but it's a real easy thing for somebody who wants to, increase their clout to make sound really dumb and stupid.
Oh, yeah. And it can land in a presidential debate and be quite effective.
Yep.
Yeah. Bryce, this has been great. I don't know what problems we necessarily solved, but we talked about it a good amount, so always fun.
We made a small dent in trying to push back in terms of, if you think that you don't trust the government, there's times and places where you shouldn't trust the government.
Yeah, but then there's Greg and Gresham making those bolts. And thank you, Greg.
Bolts,
Merry Christmas.
Which is technically a private sector thing, but it's also, but there's a reason why if you ever see the Defense Department spending a bunch of money for a bolt that might just go into a helicopter.
There you go.
There you go.
So each month on this segment, we do a listener question. If you want to hear the answer to the listener question, you got to subscribe to A New Angle at anewanglepodcast.com. Let's see who we have a question from this month. It's actually from our MTPR colleague, Ellis Julin. Yeah, let's play it.
Hi, I'm Ellis Julin, Montana Public Radio's environmental reporter, and I have a question about our economic drivers. What are the major economic drivers in Montana, and how have those changed in the last decade or more? We've seen a big increase in outdoor recreation and tourism industries, and concurrently a decline in some of the natural resource sectors like timber that were once a really big part of our economy.
Okay, changes in economic drivers. Thanks, Ellis. Bryce, this was, a little bit more in your wheelhouse when you were working for the Bureau of Business and Economic Research, but something you still keep close tabs on.
Yeah. The story of the West over the past, roughly my lifetime, right, is a transition away from historical natural resource extractive industries, right? So
timber mining, yes,
mining, agriculture, depending on where you are, fishing. So those really were the big economic drivers.
Yeah.
Back when that dam discussion, right? In fact, why did people want the dam so badly? Was cheap electricity meant that they might be able to get industry.
Yes.
And industry in the 30s and 40s meant good high-wage jobs.
Oh, and that's a subplot of the Grand Coulee Dam. That's all the time we have for this episode. If you'd like to hear more of this conversation, and receive other exclusive content, please consider a paid subscription. Thanks for listening to A New Angle. If you like what we do and want to support us directly, please consider a subscription at anewanglepodcast.com. A New Angle is recorded at Studio 49, a generous gift from UM alums Michelle and Lauren Hansen. Our presenting sponsors are First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. Kelly Larson is our producer. Maddie Jordan is our production assistant. VTO, Jeff Ament, and John Wicks made our music. And Jeff Meese is our master of all things sound. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.